Hi, I'm Tess, and this is Blind Crime. With cases like these, you'll never see it coming. Hey guys, and welcome back to Blind Crime. With cases like these, you'll never see it coming. Just a quick reminder, I will be volunteering at CrimeCon this weekend, so if you're going to be there, come and find me and say hi. I would love to meet you all. When I'm not volunteering, you will find me and my husband in Blind Crime t-shirts, so look for the podcast logo. I will also have stickers to give out if and when I am able to. So if you want a sticker, just ask. I will be happy to give you one. All right. To recap last episode, we were talking about Georgia Williams, a 17-year-old girl who went missing in Telford, Shropshire, England in May of 2013. We left off with Lynette and Steve Williams, Georgia's parents, deciding that it was time to call the police and get them involved since it had been several days since they had seen or heard from Georgia. So most of the time, whenever I cover a case, I discuss what happened, the crime that took place, and then if charges and sentencing and trials and everything had happened, I will talk about that. And I do plan to talk about that, but in this case, there is just so much more to the story than what I could cover in one 35-minute episode. So we are going to talk about the aftermath, picking up where we left off last time. When the police came to Georgia's house, they asked all of the typical questions. What did Georgia look like? How old was she? How tall was she? How much did she weigh? Her hair color, her eye color, all of those, typical questions. They also asked for a photo of Georgia, and Lynette immediately knew that she had to give them Georgia's prom photo. It was a gorgeous photo, and I will have that posted on my social media, so if you want to see it, go look at it. But her grandmother had surprised her with a professional photo shoot for her prom at the shop where they had bought Georgia's prom dress from. And it was a beautiful aquamarine colored mermaid style dress. It was gorgeous, and Georgia looked like a model. Lynette said in our Georgia that she knew that if she didn't pick a good picture, then Georgia would absolutely have a fit whenever she came home. So I thought that that was a really nice little part of the story. But while Lynette and Steve were talking with one police officer, another officer was on the radio talking to someone at the police station. Whenever they told the officers that Georgia had gone to Jamie Reynolds' house and hadn't been seen since, they asked where Jamie Reynolds lived, how far away it was, all that good stuff. And then a few minutes later, the officer who was talking on the radio said that she didn't have any reports on a Jamie Reynolds living in the area. And Steve told them, that must be a mistake because he lives at number 11 on Avondale Road, and he lives there with his parents. After this, the officer on the radio got a message back from the police station, and she abruptly collected all of her things and said, "I'm sorry, I have to go, but I'll be back in touch." And after her very sudden departure from the home, Steve and Lynette thought it was very strange that she would just leave so quickly. Steve, being a police officer himself, said that he would always, sit down with the family and go over what the next steps were going to be and talk about what the process was going to be like from here on forward, and ultimately tell them if they heard from the person who was missing to contact the police. But that didn't happen here. Lynette said in our Georgia that whatever she heard on her radio made our conversation irrelevant. A while later, one of the officers Steve knew quite well in the department called and asked if Jamie Reynolds had a weird haircut then. I assume either he emailed or sent him a text of a picture of Jamie, and Steve was able to confirm that it was him. The officer then said that they were going to Jamie's house to kick in the door, which is another thing that Steve found a little strange. If Jamie Reynolds was just some hum-ho guy, then why were they going to kick in his door? Shouldn't they ask questions first? And why did they have a picture of him in their system? Not even a minute after hanging up the phone, Lynette and Steve heard the sound of sirens up the road, and they knew that the police would be at Jamie's house in any second. In our Georgia, Lynette said that 20 minutes passed, and then the phone rang. It was the same officer who had called just a few minutes before. He told Steve there was no sign of Georgia, but no one else was in the house either. It was completely empty. They were going to see if they could find Jamie at his work, though, and question him there. The next thing they heard from police was when they came to search the Williams home. Lynette said in our Georgia that it was so confusing to her as to why they were searching their home when Georgia was out there somewhere. Steve explained that sometimes kids hide in their houses to scare their parents, or a family member would report another family member missing when they'd actually killed that family member. Of course, the search of the house came up with no results. Georgia wasn't there, and everyone knew that. In our Georgia, Lynette said that the urgency of police caught them a little by surprise. From what I can tell, British law is different in a lot of ways, but the legal age of adulthood is also different. 16 over there is like our 18 in the US. And I don't think that this applies to everything, but I do feel like over in the UK, when you're 16, you have a lot more independence than you do when you're 16 here. So whenever I heard that Lynette wasn't expecting police to take Georgia's disappearance so seriously because of her age, I had to remind myself that in their laws and ways of doing things, everything is different. Here, once you turn 18, you're an adult. And if you go missing, it's pretty much they can leave on their own free will without telling anyone kind of thing. That's what it seemed like Lynette was expecting since Georgia was 17, but that isn't what her and Steve were met with. Steve thought at first that this was because he was a police officer and they were doing it as a favor to him. As the day went on, more updates were coming in from police. News and media outlets were now reporting on Georgia, asking the public for any leads. The clock ticked by, and with every second passing by, Steve waited for another call. Eventually, the phone rang, and it was the lead detective. Jamie Reynolds had not shown up for his shift at the shop that afternoon. This led to more concerns for police and for the Williams family. After an unknown amount of time, there was a knock on the front door of the Williams home. The two officers standing at the door were friends of Steve's, like most on the force were. They asked if they could come inside and talk, and the four of them all made their way into the living room. According to our Georgia, neither of the officers spoke at first, and when one finally did, it was not the news that Steve and Lynette wanted to hear. There was evidence on Jamie's computer that he had killed Georgia. The Williams family had been holding on to hope that Georgia was still alive, that she was just being a rebellious kid, that she was going to walk through the door at any moment. And in what seemed like half of a heartbeat, their entire worlds, their lives were changed in the most horrific of ways. Lynette, Steve, and Scarlett each held each other as they all wept and screamed and fought against the belief that Georgia was really gone. It just couldn't be true. Lynette said in Our Georgia that she told Steve the police said that they believed Jamie had killed her, not that they were sure he'd done it. But Steve, being a man of the uniform, told her that they don't knock on your door that early in the morning unless they have to, and they'd only have to if someone was dead. They'd also told the family not to tell anyone they thought Georgia was dead. Tell them she was missing if anyone asked. I assume they did this for several reasons. I know here in the U.S., whenever there's an active investigation going on, sometimes all of the details aren't shared to the public because that can lead the suspect to know that they're onto him or her. So they will leave those details out in hopes that it will make it easier to catch the suspect, or if they interview the suspect, sometimes they can let some of those details slip unintentionally, and then they'll know this person knows details that only the killer would know. I don't know what happened to my voice there. I apologize. Lynette and Steve did decide to have their families come over so that they could tell them about Georgia. When the news did eventually break, they didn't want their parents, Georgia's grandparents, and aunts and uncles to be blindsided by the news. And whenever they told the family, it was just absolutely heartbreaking. In Our Georgia, it is a very sad, sad part to read or listen to. That night came and went. A parade of people, friends, officers, news reporters, grief counselors. The next day was much the same, and when Lynette decided enough was enough, she told everyone to leave. The family needed solace, they needed help, they needed comfort, so they decided to go to a nearby church. After speaking with the priest, they went into the sanctuary and decided to light a candle for Georgia. When there wasn't a lighter or a match, Steve ran across the road to the pub across the street to borrow one. After the candles had been lit, Steve went back to the pub to return the lighter, but collapsed on a chair when he saw Georgia's face on the TV. In Our Georgia, Lynette says that her and Scarlett went over to the pub a few minutes later when Steve hadn't returned and saw that he was sitting there on this little bench, just sobbing with his face in his hands. And the pub owner came over and asked if he was all right and what was going on. Steve pointed to the TV and said, "That's my daughter. She's missing. She's not coming back." And they were greeted with so much love and support from the pub. Come to find out, whenever Georgia was growing up, and I may have mentioned this last episode, she helped her grandfather go around and sell tickets or pledges or something for one of the local sports teams. And they would always go to this specific pub afterwards, and her grandfather would have a beer and she would have a Coke. And that was their daily thing over the summer. And so everyone there knew Georgia, and they couldn't believe that Georgia was gone. And so that was another really sweet moment where the community came around and just put their arms around the Williams family. And it really shows that the community was so behind the Williams family and finding Georgia. After returning home, there was yet another knock on the door. More officers with more news. They'd found Jamie Reynolds. He was in a hotel in Glasgow, a day's drive from Telford. He was alone, claiming he had been with Georgia until they got to Glasgow, then they'd gone their separate ways. The police had sent a team to go get Jamie, and they'd know more information once they were able to get him in the interview room at the police station. They'd arrested him on charges of kidnapping, although that was just a technicality. They had the photos. They knew that Georgia was dead. They knew that they had found the photos on Jamie Reynolds' computer, so they pretty much knew that Jamie Reynolds had done it. But since they didn't have a body yet, they couldn't officially charge him with the murder. They were able to search Jamie's van, though, and in doing so, they found a sock that would soon be identified as Georgia's. But there was still no other sign of Georgia or her body. The public was asked once again to help with any witnesses who may have seen Jamie or his van between Telford and Glasgow. An automated license plate tracking system had pinned down his path on main roads, but there was time unaccounted for, places without the cameras. The only reason they found Jamie in the hotel room was because he used his credit card to pay for the room. Shortly after the public request, a call came in. Someone thought they had seen Jamie that Monday near Wrexham. I don't know if I'm saying that right. They were searching the area. Jamie's story had now changed. He started claiming that he couldn't remember anything before that Monday, or anything that had happened since. He'd been sick, he said, and his memory was all but gone. Despite his lapse in memory, though, police had been able to find Jamie's camera, which also held the images of Georgia they'd found on his computer. Jamie thought he'd erased the images from the computer, but as most true crime consumers know, and most tech junkies, just because you delete something doesn't make it go away entirely. Later that Friday afternoon, an officer came to the Williams home once more, this time with the news they'd been waiting for. Georgia's body had been found on a desolated piece of land 10 miles northeast of Wrexham. She'd been identified by her red hair. Now that they had a body, they could charge Jamie with murder. As time would go on, more and more information would be found out about Jamie Reynolds and his past. But before anyone could focus on the charges against Jamie, the Williams had to get through the funeral. In our Georgia, Lynette said that she wanted to line the streets with ribbons of orange and turquoise, Georgia's favorite colors. When getting the ribbons put out, a truck stopped by Steve, and to their surprise, it was the man that Steve had arrested previously. He'd heard about Georgia and wanted to stop and give his condolences. The entire community knew of Georgia's passing, and they were all heartbroken over it. Georgia had made an impact on so many lives, and everyone was doing whatever they could to help the Williams family. Friends from school had been taking up donations to help find Georgia. When she had been found, they used the funds to put a bench in the local park, the Georgia Williams Memorial Bench. The donations kept coming in, though, even after the bench had been purchased, and everyone thought it was a good idea to donate that money to a charity when things settled down. A memorial was held at a local soccer arena, where Georgia and her granddad had spent every summer since she was a little kid selling tickets and pledges for the games. It was the only place large enough to accommodate the number of people who wanted to attend. Songs were picked out for Georgia's funeral, including Let Her Go by Passenger and Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi. A white wicker casket was picked out. Blue flowers and attendees of the funeral were asked to wear either blue or something bright. It was going to be a celebration of Georgia's life, not a time to be sad and mourn. Although nothing can stop the heartache of losing a loved one, especially in such a tragic way. When it came time to pick out what Georgia would wear, Lynette said her and Steve both agreed she should be buried in her flight cadet uniform. It was really the only available option, they thought. When the day of the funeral came, the ride to the church was emotional for the family. They drove past Georgia's old school, where Lynette says in our Georgia that students and teachers were lined up outside to pay their respects. When they passed the area where the flight cadets would meet, the cadets were lined up, saluting. Then as the hearse passed by, they began marching towards the church. When they arrived at the church, Lynette said that there were so many people there, they were standing outside. She said in our Georgia that the church seated around 400 people, and there had to at least be double that amount of people in attendance. During the service, a poem was read by Steve that was written by her friends. Then another friend from college had written a song that she sang in her honor. One of Georgia's high school teachers spoke and told everyone that in honor of Georgia, the airplane they had been working on while Georgia was in school was going to be named after her. So every time it flew, Georgia would be taking flight also. Things didn't settle down after the funeral. In fact, it seemed like things only continued to escalate. One of the officers who had been dealing with the case approached Lynette one day and proposed the funds that had come in from the donations for Georgia to be found turned into a new charity, one in honor of Georgia. The officer offered to handle everything himself, and he told Lynette he would take care of it all. She agreed. They even were able to plan out their first event, a ferret festival, with live music from local bands and all sorts of other contributors, all to raise money for this new charity. And if you don't remember from the last episode, Georgia's nickname with the flight cadets was Ferret because she would pop in and out and run around and just take care of everybody. And she reminded everyone of a ferret, and so that's what they called her. So Ferret Festival was in honor of her Air Cadets nickname, Flight Cadets. Jamie Reynolds was still denying he'd killed Georgia. He refused to admit that he had anything to do with it, despite the photos, the DNA, the semen on her body. He was basically pulling a Kohberger and staying silent. But that didn't stop investigators from digging into his past. And when they did, some were shocked by what they found. In our Georgia, Lynette says that officers came back to their house, and this time with even more bad news. Jamie had a reputation with women, and it was not a good one. He'd been arrested in the past for assaulting a woman in college. This woman had been harassed by Reynolds for a long period of time, and luckily for her, she had escaped from his house when he had tried to attack her. But nothing happened. When this woman called the police, it took the officer an hour to come to her house. She took her statement, said she was going to arrest Jamie, and then get back in touch with her. But the police, in the end, didn't do anything. She never got another call. After this, the woman was afraid to go to school or work. Anytime she saw Jamie Reynolds, he would hassle her and harass her, calling her vulgar names and even trying to hit the woman with his car. When she brought this up to the college, she was scared of another student. They wouldn't do anything because of his, quote, human rights. As Lynette said in our Georgia, Georgia is dead, and another woman had to change her name, and they're worried about his human rights. This young woman was told to avoid Jamie Reynolds, and she'd be fine. But after so much harassment, the woman eventually had to drop out of school, move to another city, and change her name, and basically start completely over. And somehow, Jamie Reynolds was still able to find her again, and continued to harass her. But still, nothing was done about it. This woman, who, for an understandable reason, remains anonymous, came to the Williams home after Georgia's funeral and spoke with them. In our Georgia, Lynette said she almost couldn't meet with her because of how much she resembled Georgia. Red hair, short, petite. But she was incredibly shy and timid, again, understandably after she'd been through what this woman had been through. She explained to them what had happened with Jamie Reynolds and what her life had been like since she'd met him. Steve couldn't believe that the police hadn't done more than what they'd had. He said in our Georgia that they should have come back the next day to get another statement to take photos for a report of any injuries and bruising, and they didn't do that. Not only had police not taken Jamie's threats and actions towards this other woman seriously, they'd had in their possession for an unknown amount of time, but long enough to do something about it, a list of other young women Jamie wanted to kill. On that list was Georgia. The other anonymous woman, and I believe 32 or 34 others, including 2 of Scarlett's closest friends. Whether Scarlett was on that list is still unknown. So the police had all this information for quite a period of time, and they'd done nothing. He'd been warned, but always let off the hook. He'd been to the station, but never officially charged. He'd been able to complete school, get a job, and live his life, all while plotting and planning and calculating how he was going to kill until he finally set his eyes on his target, Georgia. The officers who told Lynette and Steve this information were beyond outraged. They knew Georgia's death would have been prevented if Reynolds had been arrested years ago, and in our Georgia, Lynette quotes them as saying, "Someone is going to lose their, insert word here, job for this." As more information came to light, it would be revealed that some of the people working closest on Georgia's case were some of the ones who let Reynolds roam free, including the man who was running the charity in Georgia's name. While all this information was being brought to the surface, a trial was being set in place for Jamie Reynolds. In the UK, they don't have the death penalty, and sometimes life sentences aren't actual life sentences. But if I recall correctly, a murder is an automatic life sentence. The big question was, would Jamie Reynolds have a full life sentence or a partial? Each hearing before the trial was nerve-wracking for the Williams family. Lynette wanted nothing more than to wrap her hands around Jamie's throat and do to him what he did to Georgia, strangle him until he took his last breath. But she knew that she could not do that, and she did not do that. She couldn't sit in the courtroom when the details of the case were being talked about, but she said in our Georgia that she was at every hearing, every day of the trial, the sentencing. She was there for it all. And when the time came for Jamie to make his plea, guilty or not guilty, to their entire shock and surprise, Jamie Reynolds pled guilty. They knew now that he would receive a life sentence, but they still weren't sure if it would be a full or a partial. A separate hearing would determine that, and in the meantime, everyone simply had to wait. Simply, like it's that easy, I'm sure. But when it came time for sentencing, under bated breath and weak knees, the Williams family heard the judge say a full life sentence. Lynette says in our Georgia that the judge told Jamie Reynolds that he was a serial killer in the making, and that if he was ever released, he would be a danger to women no matter how long he served. The judge said that Reynolds killed for the thrill, because he wanted to, because he liked it, and nothing can fix that in a person. Relief flooded Lynette and Steve and Scarlett, and they knew now that no one else would ever be hurt by Jamie Reynolds, and justice for Georgia had been served. A short time later, though, Jamie Reynolds appealed his sentence and again brought up his, quote, human rights. He was young, 22 at the time, and he had his whole life to live. It was inhumane to make such a young person spend their entire life in jail. But despite the worry and fear that came to the Williams family, Reynolds' appeal was denied, and to this day he is still behind bars serving his time for the murder of Georgia Williams. There is still so much to this story, y'all. This is the Cliff Notes version of it. I know I left out things that should have been told and probably talked about things that didn't have to be in here, but Georgia's story has captivated my heart. I can't imagine what her family has gone through in losing her and what they've endured since then. I highly, highly, highly recommend that you read Our Georgia. It is such a gripping story, and it is written beautifully. I listened to the audiobook on Audible, and whoever the narrator is, portrays the emotions that are written so incredibly well. When I say that I sobbed through the book, I mean I wept. I sat on my couch listening to it in just blubbery, snotty tears. It is one of the best written books I have ever heard or read, and this story is going to stay with me for the rest of my life. In an article written by Robin Eveleigh and Harri Evans from NorthWalesLive.com in May of 2023, Lynette shared that they were finally seeing some happiness in their lives. Scarlett was due to have a baby, a little boy, last year, and they were absolutely thrilled to be grandparents. Lynette also said that she knew Georgia would have been an amazing aunt, spoiling the baby and getting into everything with him. Scarlett is now a registered midwife, and in this article was over the moon to be expecting and to be a mother. A link to the article will be in the show notes. The Williams family filed a lawsuit against the police department and the officers involved in the case. I will happily do another episode on this if y'all are interested, but I decided to leave it here for now. Something that I do want to add, though, is that in our Georgia, Lynette said that she didn't want to speak to national news outlets at the time of Georgia's death because to her, it felt like they were just wanting a gripping headline. Local news sources were telling her story so that the community in which Georgia impacted and loved could mourn and process and grieve with each other. Their community was like a family, and Lynette and Steve wanted Georgia's loved ones to know what happened to her. I don't ever want to take a story just because I think that it will get a lot of clicks, a lot of listens, a lot of downloads. Whenever I talk about a case, whenever I talk about a person, it is because their story reached me. It is because it impacted me. It is because their name needs to still be out there because their story deserves to be told. And so I do hope that in telling the story of Georgia, that everyone who hears it will remember Georgia and remember that she was a human being, that she was a person, that she had a life, that she was loved and cherished, and that she is missed beyond all belief right now. And she always will be. Georgia Williams is never going to be forgotten. She had that big of an impact on her small community, and her community is always going to keep her memory alive. And I think that even on this side of the pond, we can also help keep Georgia's memory alive. I will have photos of Georgia on my Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so be sure to give me a follow at blindcrimepod on Instagram and Twitter, and you can search Blind Crime on Facebook, and I should come up. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and leave me a 5-star review. The more reviews I have, the more the algorithm pushes the show out to other people, and I'm trying to reach as many people as possible. Thank you guys so much for listening this week, and I hope to see you all at CrimeCon this weekend. That is all I have for this week, though, so until next week, keep your eyes open.